Good morning, everybody. Welcome on this Friday morning. We're so excited to have everybody here. I'm going to start off and introduce my colleagues and co-presenters to everyone today. Thank you all for choosing our session. We're excited to have everybody here to learn about the Movable Project. Um, First up, we have Kristen Lilivis, who is a professor of English and director of our digital humanities at Marshall University, where she teaches courses on digital humanities and contemporary American and African American literatures. Her research explores issues of identity and diverse texts across a range of media, including works of electronic literature. She is the project director and co-editor of Movable, Narratives of Recovery in Place. Welcome, Kristen. We also have Hilton Cordoba, who is an assistant professor of geography at Marshall University, where he teaches courses on mapping, urbanization, and transportation. His research focuses on spatial analysis of urban and transportation problems. Welcome, Hilton. We also have Stefan Schuberlin, who is an assistant professor of English at Marshall University. His research focuses on digital editing and authorship attribution, as well as American literature of the 19th century. I'm pleased to introduce Rebecca Tomlin. She is one of our recovery coaches at the Marshall University Collegiate Recovery Community and a psychology student at Marshall University. Becca is a graduate of the Fresh Start program and equates recovery to freedom. And I'm Amy Saunders, the managing director of Marshall University Center of Excellence for Recovery, which strives to increase well-being and recovery for West Virginians. My research focuses on behavioral health disparities in Appalachia. So welcome to our session, everyone. We are so excited to have you with us all on this Friday morning. Stefan?
Good morning. I'm not going to be starting. I'll hand it over to Amy in a second here, but I'll be doing the slides. And we had some technical issues with sharing a video that's in the slides, so we moved that out. So I'll show you a brief intro video that we have, a brief promotional video that gives you a quick peek at what do we think Movable is and wants to be, and then I'll hand it back to Amy and we'll proceed with the planned presentation. So let me briefly share things here. You should be seeing YouTube now, and I'll start the video in a second here. It looks like it's working. There should be sound. I'm hoping it's not too loud. If it is, I apologize.
This looks different for everyone. At Movable, we highlight each person's unique story. Our website gives people a platform to share what recovery means to them. We provide the tools that make it easy for folks to share their stories. Our interactive map connects people to places where stories have been shared throughout Appalachia and across the country. By definition, movable means capable of being moved. Recovery is possible, and we are moving beyond stigma. These are our stories. We are movable.
So welcome everybody again. We're so excited to have you all here, and I'm going to start us off a little bit talking about stigma and why projects like Movable are just so important to folks who have substance use disorder and folks in recovery. So thanks for joining us. Next slide. So for some time, individuals in the nation and in Appalachia have been dealing with rising rates of individuals affected by substance use and substance use disorders. And there's been a lot of great work that's been happening across the nation. It's been happening in our Appalachian states and at the local level to really try to increase services for individuals and help families who are affected by substance use. Great strides have been made, but there's still a lot of work that we have to do. And one of those areas and issues is really addressing stigma and discrimination that happens for individuals who have substance use disorders. So it's really important that we make known that individuals who have substance use disorders, it's a treatable condition. And that's really important for us to be talking about as we kind of move forward. And we're going to talk this morning briefly just about some things that individuals can do to kind of help address stigma related to substance use disorders. Stigma, is a perceived negative attitude often towards individuals who have a attribute, a characteristic, or condition. And it often leads us to discrimination, which is where we would treat people negatively because they have that condition or that characteristic. And so, one of the things that's really important is that we really start to focus on how we can address this issue and help individuals who are dealing with a substance use issue, individuals who are in recovery, and kind of make some of those strives and push that forward. So, about over 20 million individuals in the United States have a substance use disorder, but really only about half of those individuals receive treatment. I think the latest rates from SAMHSA say that about 12 million individuals were able to receive treatment last year. And there's a lot of different factors for that. Some individuals, it's an access issue. And in Appalachia, we have a lot of access issues related to services. About 50 of our 55 counties in West Virginia are mental health professional shortage areas. So there's access issues, there's transportation issues. Um, but we also have, sometimes individuals aren't ready for treatment. That's another issue. But stigma and discrimination can also play a factor in there. And some reports from SAMHSA and some of their data, show that about 20% of people who have substance use disorder were worried that, um, if individuals found out about their substance use disorder, that it would affect their employment. About 17 were worried that their neighbors or community might view them differently. And we recently did a survey and some listening sessions with some rural communities in West Virginia. And those communities reported to us that about 80%, over 80%, felt that negative attitudes towards individuals um, with substance use disorders or in recovery prevent them from receiving treatment. So it's really important that we all kind of really start to learn ways that we can all address this. One of the first ways that we can do this, and next slide, is to really think about our language. Language has changed a lot. For individuals who have substance use disorders and individuals who are in recovery. So it's really important that we start to focus and think about our language. This is a slide from SAMHSA, Words Matter, and they have a lot of great resources for individuals if you're interested in looking at any of those. Um, it's really important that we start to change our language and use person-centered language and use the correct terms. A lot of language that's out there has negative connotations to it. It blames individuals instead of looking at this as again a health condition. So we really need to start to think about ways that we can use person-centered language and use appropriate terms. Words are very powerful. We know that, and we also know that language and photos can help perpetuate those negative stigmas and those negative attitudes that we have. So we really need to be aware of that and promoting person-centered language. The Addictionary is another great resource. If you're looking for resources, they update that regularly, and it's again, language is very fluid and it's changing. So we want to promote individuals are using appropriate language to address stigma. Um, and then next slide. A couple of other things that we can do, and some of the research is showing, we know education is really important in addressing stigma. We've also found that contact-based approaches with those with lived experience is really important. So whenever you can kind of combine those things together, education with somebody with lived experience, it gives you a better result. We also know just having experiences with individuals with lived experiences are important. So, doing things and promoting experiences in your communities or on your campus can help us. Address stigma. So, on Marshall's campus and many other campuses, I know a lot of folks are doing what we call ally training. And so, we're teaching students and faculty about ways to address stigma and appropriate language. And those activities are great to reducing stigma. Focusing in on advocacy and policy, you know, that's kind of really important because we want to look at that big system lens. And it's really important that we're focusing on educating our legislators and other stakeholders who make, you know, rules or policies that can negatively affect uh, individuals who have substance use disorder, who are in recovery, or their families. We need to be working with them to really promote policies and moving away from things that are punishing to more policies that are really helpful in helping individuals get into treatment and recovery. We know that marketing and media about recovery are really important, and they are a great tool to addressing stigma. And you'll hear about some media at the end of this presentation from one of our presenters that was done with some of the campuses. And then finally, we know that positive narratives and stories about recovery are really important. And when we look at Appalachian culture, we know that narratives and stories are a really important part of our culture. And so, one way that we can do this is really to address stories about recovery, and which is what these wonderful colleagues have done with Movable. So, I'm going to turn it over to them and let them take it from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. So as you all saw from the video, and as Amy talked a little bit about, Movable is an interactive GIS-enabled community website that collects and archives written and visual narratives about recovery in Appalachia and beyond. So we're trying to shift the conversation from some of the stigmatizing info that Amy talked about, so stats on incarcerations, overdoses, and death that you see a lot when you search for info about Appalachia, and we want to focus on stories of struggle, community, and hope. Next slide. So the idea for Movable began in 2016 when Amy, Kristen Steele, a former Marshall professor, and I worked on Addiction in Appalachia, a community storytelling event focused on substance use. And following that event, Kristen and I joined Lynn O'Connell, who's also associated with Marshall, on an endeavor to train local reporters on using non-stigmatizing language and images. And these two projects highlighted a need for individuals in recovery to be even more in control of their own narratives. Next slide. And so that's when Movable was born, thanks to a $5,000 grant from the West Virginia Humanities Council. Hilton and Stefan came on board, and we also brought on a web designer from Marshall IT, and we created a Google Maps-based prototype. And you can see with the arrows, those little blue triangles or flags are clickable stories on that field of green and gray that was our map at the time. Based on that prototype, we were able to eventually create a site that has a more usable interface and a clearer purpose, thanks to feedback from focus groups, research by faculty and student assistants, and funding from outside sources. Next slide. Recovery stories now, rather than the map, are central. Visitors to the site are greeted, whether on the homepage or in the map interface, with quotes from the contributors that highlight important elements of their recovery. In the next slide. So currently we have over 60 stories of recovery, and we have more in the queue that we're working to get online. And we use the word stories when we're talking about what we've archived on the site, but really the term is too narrow. So we have nonfiction narratives, poems, video and audio interviews, photography and collages, and even a musical composition inspired by recovery. Most of the stories have come from individuals in recovery from substance use disorder, but we also have stories focused on alcohol use disorder, as well as stories from family and friends, loved ones who've been affected by SUD or AUD. So while storytellers can submit text, images, audio, and video through the website, most of the site's content has been collected through one-on-one interviews, group workshops run by faculty, students, and regional recovery organization leaders, or partnerships with recovery orgs. Once a story is submitted, our student research assistants make sure it can be identified by the contributor's name or pseudonym, geographic coordinates, and thematic and genre-based tags, which allow visitors to the site to find recovery stories by looking for people they know, places familiar to them, or concepts they're interested in. Next slide. So for instance, Mitzi's story can be discovered by searching for her name, looking near Fayetteville on the map, or selecting the tags family, faith, healthcare, job, or prose. And what I want to touch on here is the site's navigability. Visitors to the site have multiple paths to find stories, and then the site will direct them to other stories, either in that geographic area or with the same tags. So visitors can also engage storytellers by choosing from a limited menu of feedback. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Okay. Next slide. So how did we get here? Let me try to plug in headphones to see if it works. Okay. Movables attracted over $200,000 in grant funding, primarily from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, SAMHSA's opioid response grant. And those funds have gone towards site development and collaborating with over 30 community members, students, and faculty to collect texts and conduct research on stigma related to substance misuse. So our editors and student research assistants, all of whom are paid, have held participatory mapping sections, which Hilton will talk more about, and storytelling workshops, which Stefan will touch on, in locations from Minneapolis, Minnesota to Morgantown, West Virginia, creating a community-produced site, as well as novel research opportunities in critical cartographies and document analysis. And when I say that it's community-produced, what I mean is that we work with the community to discover the best strategies to ethically collect and share stories. So we pay our employees, including community partners, university staff, faculty and students in English, geography, journalism, classics, psychology, linguistic anthropology, video production, addiction studies, and digital humanities. And the video you watched at the beginning, that was created by some of our students in video production, for example. We employ individuals in recovery, as well as those with loved ones who've experienced SUD and AUD, and students who are also studying addiction. And when engaging with the public, we similarly keep ethics and social justice in mind, putting our funding toward efforts to make the site accessible to all. So the site was designed to be mobile first, so individuals with low bandwidth and those who surf the internet primarily through their phones can access and submit stories. Next slide. We also work to make storytelling opportunities available in person, and especially since the pandemic, virtually. And we've collected stories at local recovery events, run writing workshops at community centers and libraries, and done phone and video interviews on demand. We work with community members to determine the structure of these collaborations so that Movable is really a project done with and by rather than for individuals in recovery. So for example, at one of our early workshops, I think this was at WVU, we brought a bunch of writing prompts and everybody wanted to work on art instead. And so it became really clear to us, and one of the things we work on when doing workshops is making them flexible so that those who are there can decide what they want that collaboration to look like. Next slide. The other way we really think about working with members of the community is getting feedback from them, and then after that feedback, changing things on our site. So this is, again, a little clip from Mitzi's story. And when we talked with recovery organization leaders, it was made clear that traditional open-ended comments weren't always useful and were often harmful for those in recovery. So we created new options for engagement. So people can select things like, I can relate, thanks for sharing, or I wish you the best. And visitors can also select multiple of those options, which innovates on the social media convention of just choosing one emoji, for example. Next slide. In addition to talking with individuals in recovery community about site development, we've also partnered with local organizations to collect stories. So some of our partners include Marshall, Harmony House, WVU, Cabell County Library, Recovery Point, the Southern West Virginia Collegiate Recovery Network, and the University of Minnesota. We have an ongoing collaboration with the Great Rivers Regional System for Addiction Care, which has organized their own storytelling series, and they allow us to archive their stories on our site and also make them more accessible. So we transcribe everything so that somebody could watch it or listen to it or read it, depending on what their abilities are and their desire is. And we also have recently worked with West Virginia Recovery Advocacy Project and the Women's Alliance for Recovery movement, which Becca will talk more about in a few minutes. And our stories have been featured at events such as All Walks of Recovery, Recovery for a Change, the Meigs County Recovery Walk, and the National Collegiate Recovery Day. Next. And you can always find us online though, and like I said, we're updating things very frequently, so we hope people will be return visitors and check out new stories in their area or just related to content that they enjoy. All right, that's all from me. Next, I think we have Hilton.
And thank you for that, Kristen. And so as she was mentioning, mapping is a key component of the Movable project. And so in my piece, I'll be talking about the role of maps, both in the opioid crisis, but also then how we hope that Movable will specifically address some of the unintended consequences of maps. And by that, I mean that you should think of maps as kind of being two sides of the same coin, and that maps have been used a lot in the effort of policy implementation, really monitoring, for one, the extent of the opioid crisis, but also the funds and the different policies, how well they're working. So that side, although has been very helpful, of course, for the opioid crisis, it also has had, as I said, some unintended side effects. And so through Movable, we're hoping to also address some of those side effects. Next slide, please. So when we talk about mapping in the opioid crisis, we're specifically looking at the more traditional way of mapping. And by that, I mean the more top-down approach, where you have individuals from different government agencies, right, across the hierarchy of government, particularly in public health, who really are focused a lot on the quantification of the opioid crisis through different metrics, whether it be overdose rates, fatality, number of prescriptions, you name it. And although, again, that is very helpful in terms of, again, getting a scope of the problem and areas that need to be addressed, that does have some unintended side effects. So next slide. So to give you some examples, here we have a digital mapping platform for the distribution of naloxone. And so here we're looking at the allocation of naloxone across the state of West Virginia, and looking at where they were implemented, before EMS arrived at the scene or afterwards. And so again, if you approach this from a policy perspective, and whether you want to evaluate, one, the allocation of naloxone and how well they're working, this is great, right? This is kind of very useful information, and you can even get more breakdown, or in terms of demographics, as you see here on the right. But that also kind of tends to emphasize, for example, some areas that might be experiencing a lot of overdose, right? And with that, that carries a lot of stigmatization, as Amy was addressing earlier. Next slide. Here's another example. These maps are showing you on the right the proportion of the residents in the state of West Virginia who had an opioid prescription in 2017. And the map on the left is actually showing you out of those residents who had a prescription, on average, how many prescriptions do they have? And so again, if you're trying to analyze, okay, the size of your population you're working with, and where resources need to be allocated, but these maps do the job, right? You can clearly see the areas that tend to stand out from the rest. And so, these so-called hotspots, again, for policy, they're great, right? It allows you to really identify the places that you need to focus on. But that also brings, a focus on that area, and, stigmatization with it. Next slide. So, when we think of these maps, then the reason why they tend to stigmatize is because of where they draw their power. And that is, again, the fact that they're being created by these government agencies who, rarely do we question their data sources. Rarely do we question, what other perspectives could they have shown with the same data. And so, because in many instances they get taken as, the whole truth and, very accurate information, we just take it at face value. And, that, again, has that unintended consequence of stigmatization of places, communities, neighborhoods, across different scale. Next slide. So with movable, then what we're hoping to do is to really counter map or try to mitigate some of those unintended side effects. And the way we are hoping to achieve that is by employing what's known as critical cartography. And this is, nothing too new, but, it is something that talks about how we go about really shifting the map making process in a way that we empower the people who in the past were being mapped. So in the case of the opioid crisis and recovery, right, there's all these stats about, as I was saying, overdose rates and incarceration and you name it. But there isn't a whole lot of information on recovery. And part of that problem is the fact that, well, recovery is very hard to quantify. And because of that, that also makes it very hard to map. And so by shifting this power structure, you're really allowing the people then to become the creators of knowledge, the ones who provide the data by telling their stories. And therefore, you really empower them because you really allow them to drive the narrative. Next slide. So, so as I was saying, right, when we shift this power structure, we're really now doing more of a bottom-based approach. We're soliciting the input from the community, and they really then at that point are more in control of the information that is being provided, and really, casting the light on something that in the past was, in the shadows or perhaps not known so much about. Next slide. So when you think then of mapping recovery, we're really looking at something, as I was saying, that is very hard to map, in part because it is not linear. And by that I mean is that it's not like you can go and say and track data on, well, we have this amount of individuals who have been recovered. You might be able to get some of that information, but if you try to think of, let's say, of when someone entered recovery, when someone finished recovery, it's very hard to pinpoint, right? That starting point and the end point. The other aspect of that makes it very difficult to map recovery is that you might think, well, you can go to and quantify how many recovery centers you have in a community. Well, that is true, but then, not everyone who is in recovery goes to these centers, right? And Amy was talking about some of the issues with access, particularly in our region. So you'll be leaving a lot of the community in recovery outside of these statistics. And the other aspect too is that, part of the recovery community, and this is something Kristen touched on, is not just the individual itself, right, going through recovery, but is those allies, is those close relatives and friends. And so what we're hoping to do with Movable is to really build a more encompassing platform where create a space really for the entire recovery community. And that way they can, be acknowledged, right? And not so much focus on the quantification. It's like, oh, we have this many, or, and here and this many over there. But it's more about really their stories, their journey. Next slide, please. So Kristen was talking about some of the different ways in which participants in the platform can express themselves. So here are just some examples of that: collages, your more traditional, writing a letter, also making maps, right? Expressing, their journey in recovery through maps. You'll be surprised, for example, of how, movable, and I mean movable in the sense of, mobility, how some of the individuals in recovery are really from going from place to place, right, as they are struggling, in recovery, but also as they also, are in the search for hope, right, the search for a new start. So Movable is also about, the mobility of people in recovery. And, in many ways, maps are the best way or the best channel to really communicate that. Next slide. So here's our platform, and here are the maps. So for one, I just say it's a great improvement from the first maps that we used in Google. But the goal here, you might say, well, I only see a dot here. And although, at face value, that might not seem like a lot, in many ways, that's perhaps the most powerful thing a map can do for people in recovery. And that is that it gives them a place, right? It acknowledges their existence, right? When you're put on a map, you're there. And historically, there's always been the biggest power a map can do for anybody and for any place. So if you look at our overall footprint, right, our geographic distribution, although we're based obviously here in West Virginia, and we have more of an Appalachian focus, we really have contributors as far west, in Arizona, as far north as in Minnesota, and also, from Texas. And one of the unique things that we are actually very proud of when it comes to this mapping platform is that we obviously are aware that well, by mapping stories of recovery, you can also have some of the unintended side effects of the other maps. And the way we try to mitigate some of those unintended side effects with this mapping platform is by actually only allowing users to look at the location up to a certain level. So in other words, once you zoom in into a particular area, you don't get to know the specific location of where the story is coming from. And again, that is to really mitigate the potential for stigma of a particular place. So once you reach a certain zoom level, you basically get prompted with this loop or perspective, right, where you get a radius saying, hey, here you have this certain amount of stories, right? And so if you want to know about them, you want to read them, the stories from this community, well, here you go, right? And that's basically the tab that you have here on the left. So this is how Movable is hoping then to really change the power structure in the mapping process when it comes to the opioid crisis, hoping to really provide a platform for people to tell their stories, and more importantly, to leverage the power of maps. And that is it for me, and I now turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Sherberlin.
All right, thank you, Hilton. Sorry for the slight delay here. Hope everyone can see me. Okay, so I'll be talking a little bit about future directions for Movable. We've heard a lot about sort of the reasoning that went into creating Movable, what we hope to build with Movable, and I'll be talking about sort of where we see it going from here. And I'll be doing that by looking at 3 different domains: pedagogy, advocacy, and scholarship. And obviously, we've talked about advocacy a lot, and that makes sense because that's really our core mission right now, right? We want to be a platform that publishes voices from the recovery community, is sort of a connecting point for different recovery organizations and people advocating on behalf of that community, and to sort of create a counter narrative to the narrative of the region that is so omnipresent in media. And that's obviously something that we want to build on and that we want to grow. And that really means expanding on our story archiving, right? The stories are really the heart of the project. And so we really want to focus on transcribing our backlog of stories and expanding our story collection effort. And we've had great success with running some virtual writing workshops. Our graduate student collaborators have done excellent work there. So we will certainly expand on that. So that has been wonderful. We've had some submissions through the site directly, which is always exciting to us because that tells us, wow, people are actually using the site. So that's been great, right? But the real core has been these writing workshops that Kristen mentioned. And we have like a lot of exciting prompts, right? Different pathways, from creative writing to sort of arts and crafts. So we have a lot of these great materials, a lot of which we obviously can't use right now because of the coronavirus pandemic, right? But that's also another limiting factor, another bottleneck, and that's that this is basically our story collection right now. It's a neatly organized trolley that we take to events and organize events around, right? And obviously that's a limiting factor to a degree. We can't really be everywhere in Appalachia, right? Right now, running a movable workshop is connected to somebody from Movable being there and doing it. And as a digital project, we can see that that's something we should probably adjust, that we should focus on upscaling that to some degree. And we've decided to do that by creating a digital version of our trolley toolkit, which basically means we're sort of taking psychological test batteries as a model here. And the idea is really taking our prompts, taking our materials, digitizing them, and standardizing instructions for those. So if somebody, let's say in Northern Alabama, wants to run a writing workshop, but they might not know exactly what to do, and they obviously might not be able to get us there, they can then instead connect to our digital toolkit, pick a specific subsection of the toolkit and run it, right? And it doesn't only give them sort of a well-traveled and well-developed toolkit to run, but it also allows them to tell their participants, thank you for sharing your story. This has been great. If you want to share it further, here's a possibility for you to basically become a published author with us, right? So it comes with a publishing pipeline, which we think is really important, right? It tells people your story is important. We might be in a small writing workshop in rural Appalachia, but you can make this be of to a degree national importance because you can have it published on this sort of neat, engaging website. So that's really been something that we've worked on mostly before the coronavirus pandemic really hit. And we've sort of run into a dead end here to a degree because obviously once we've transcribed all of our instructions, once we have our materials digitized, we would want to run a workshop like this a couple of times to see what kinks need to be ironed out, what adjustments we need to make before we can really say, this is a final polished toolkit, please use it for your purposes. So we've stalled there for a moment, but we're really hoping to pick up on this again once some of the restrictions begin to be lifted and people are more vaccinated, and we can actually run in-person workshops again, right? This will be CC BY, so people can adapt it and change it, right? As long as they credit us, that's absolutely fine. It'll be freely available. We don't plan on monetizing any of this, right? We think it's a real asset to communities who want to do these writing and creative workshops, but it's also an immense asset to us because it will potentially help us collect stories from places that we cannot physically reach. So that's a major focus that we'll return to once we are able to actually hold in-person workshops again. So that's been our advocacy angle. That's our plans for the future. Another angle that we haven't really thought about up until maybe the middle of last year was pedagogy. Initially, we mainly envisioned us as sort of a small team doing this advocacy website. But that's, as you heard from what Kristen said, that we've significantly expanded. We have a lot of wonderful student collaborators, community collaborators, different professors on the Marshall Compass working with us. So we've done a lot of work in the past year sort of internally professionalizing. We've come up with clear workloads, clear workflow models. We have editorial guidelines that we're working on, editorial policies. All of these will be published once they're a little bit more polished. We have clear expectations for our student collaborators, clear tasks that come with names from RAs to senior RAs to ultimately publishers, which would be Kristen Helton and us and me, right? So that's been really helpful to envision Movable itself as some sort of training and pedagogy tool. Connected to that sort of internal pedagogization of some sort, right? We've also imagined We also collaborated more and more with other places in Marshall right now, right? We're already quite interdisciplinary. You heard Kristen talk about where all of our student collaborators are from, right? But we also collaborated with the Center of Teaching and Learning. We've heard a little bit of the music collaboration. So there's a lot of different places in Marshall right now that started collaborating with us in a way that we didn't initially envision. And it's been really exciting to see sort of that process develop naturally, and people contacting us saying, hey, I have this cool idea, do you want to work with me on that? And usually we say yes, and we're really excited about it. One of these examples, for instance, and I'm not going to play it because there's usually like an audio issue if I try to do that, but I highly encourage you to look that up on the website. Chris mentioned briefly, we had somebody from the music department who does like sort of electronic jazz kind of music, really interesting, and he contacted us and said, I wrote this song about this one story, would you be interested in that? So we contacted the person who wrote the story, who said, yes, great idea, let's go for it. So we added to the site and then spun that off into a music and movable call for contributors. Not a lot of takers yet, right? But that's a sort of a neat model where something organically happened in sort of the field of student interactions that we didn't anticipate, but that opened up this new perspective on movable for us. So what that means is we're really open to collaborations. There's no reason that we should limit our collaborations to just Marshall, right? So if you are interested in using some of Movable in your classroom, if you have students working on projects that could potentially be of interest to Movable, I don't know, if you're a high school teacher and you're doing something in class and you want to use movable data, that's amazing. We want to collaborate with you. Contact us. Everybody is sort of everybody sort of against their will learned how to do all of this virtual teaching and learning, right? So there's really no obstacle. We can basically go anywhere you want us to be, and we're really excited to collaborate with you on that. So if any of this at all strikes you as a potential pedagogical collaboration, please get in contact with us. We would love to work with you. And besides pedagogy, there's obviously scholarship, right? Clearly, the two fields that I talked about, advocacy and pedagogy, that's also scholarship, right? So to a degree, that's a bit of an artificial distinction. But what I mean by scholarship here specifically is that right now, Movable is a project that's clearly focused at a general audience. It's supposed to be engaging, friendly, uplifting. Scholars can clearly use it, right? But they're not the target audience right now. And while we don't plan on any major revisions to the site structure anytime really soon, the next major revamp in the future will probably to address scholars and academics more directly. Right now, we have elements of what we envision future revisions to build on. This is the view you get when you search for stories, and you might not even see it, but there's a little show advanced filters here. That's actually purposefully a little bit hidden because we really want people not to notice that right now, because the functionality is there, but the data isn't yet. So what we started doing recently is soliciting demographic information from people. This is all strictly voluntary and only for stories going forward, so we're not going back and resoliciting this. But the idea is that a scholar might be interested in filtering stories and reading stories based on certain demographic markers, right? So for us, that's age, gender, race, faith, highest level of education. There may be others. And if you think there are others that might be super interesting for you, please let us know, right? But the point here is, as a scholar, I might want to look at how gender influences how people narrate recovery. So I might want to separate that out in my searches, right? We don't have a lot of stories that have this information yet, but going forward, that will be a really exciting option, right? So this is what it looks like on the side right now. I didn't screenshot that wider because it doesn't display nicely here and you wouldn't be able to read it, but it's the same information you just saw on the physical form that we use for the workshop runs. So again, we're sort of hiding this right now, but functionality is there. And where this really gets powerful, I think, will be when we combine these demographic filters with batch download options. So right now, you can send us an email saying, I want your whole corpus, and we will say, great, here's a link, you can download it, which will already enable you to do interesting assessments. So if you're interested in natural languages, conversational language, you want to run digital analyses of that, this is a really interesting corpus. It's basically sort of an interview/informal language corpus specific to Appalachia. And there isn't a lot of corpora like that out there. So if that interests you, you can already get that data from us. But it's going to be really powerful if you combine that with, say, I want all stories written by people who identify as women and all stories written by people who identify as men, and I want to see what differences there are and how gender identity influences how they narrate recovery. Once we have enough of that data assessed, that's going to lead to some really, I believe, interesting scholarly discussions of this. And obviously, this is just one of the things that we're envisioning. We really hope to have sort of a separate portal on the site for scholars that enables some of these analyses in some sort of future site revamp in 2 to 3 years, maybe, right? But obviously, this is also something where our perspective is limited. So if you see a potential angle to run analyses with Movable, if there's something that you think would be really interesting to be able to assess sort of quickly, maybe directly on the website, that would interest you as a scholar, please let us know, right? We're in the early planning stages for this. So the more feedback we get now, the more helpful it'll be for us. So that's really sort of the least immediate step that we're working on, but also I think one of the more powerful ones. So again, always happy to collaborate. If you see a potential project here, this is where you get your foot in the door. Let us know, and we'll discuss it and probably implement it going forward. So I think this is my last slide. So I've talked a little bit about future directions, right? I talked about the different domains that we see Movable covering and where we see Movable going. And after this sort of future vision, we'll take a slight step back and I'll hand it over to Becca, who will talk a little bit about some of the exciting things that are currently going on. So I'll hand it over to Becca and thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rebecca Tomlin, and I am from Person in Long-Term Recovery and a recovery coach at Marshall University Collegiate Recovery Community, and currently a psychology major at Marshall. I want to start talking a little bit about International Women's, presented by the West Virginia Recovery Advocacy Project and Women's Alliance for Recovery Movement. We're really excited to see so many women involved in our social media posts promoting women in recovery from all walks of life, different diversities, and individuals in recovery in and outside of the state of West Virginia. We feel that it is so important to recognize the individuals who recover and can change their lives for the better. Individuals in recovery can not only recover from substance use disorder, but also are able to reunite with their family, gain employment, obtain higher education, and become productive members of society. Individuals with substance use disorder sometimes can be fearful about sharing their story due to stigma. So we are truly grateful for women and men who are able to share that individuals can and do recover. Next slide. If you're a woman in recovery and would like to join us for the International Women's Month, we ask that you email movableproject@gmail.com. You can include a photo of yourself, 5 words or fewer to finish the quote. Women in recovery are, and the name as you would like for it to appear. Next slide. Here is our website, www.movableproject.org. And you can contact us at Twitter and also Facebook. And thank you.
Thanks, Becca. I think that's the end of our slide presentation. And so, and now we can turn over to questions. Okay, I see a question here. Do you want me to read that out loud or is...
Yeah, I think that'd be good. Do you want to do that, Amy?
Yeah, I'm trying to open it.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I'll go ahead and read this first one if you want then. This is
Yeah.
from Chris Green, which I think is former Marshall professor Chris Green. So hello. Amazing projects, behind the scenes questions, which we can answer some or all of. Can you tell us more about the process of selecting, prioritizing, and editing stories, images, etc.? Who's in the driver's seat of coordinating and making decisions about the project? The four of us or others? And then what about interfacing, getting IRB approval? Anybody want to take one of those?
I can talk a little bit about selecting and editing. So I think I mentioned some of the policy documents that we're working on, but the overall sort of gist to these is we basically don't want to select and edit too much. So essentially, we have never rejected any submission. As long we might edit or discuss edits with a contributor if we feel like it too clearly identifies a private residence or a specific person that may not want to be involved, a third person. That would be something where we would probably intervene. We haven't had extreme language to a degree where we feel like we might want to intervene. In terms of visuals, that's something that right now we usually select. Sometimes people who submit a story do submit a photo, and then we generally use that unless we would feel like it contains any visual triggers. So that's the extent of our editing. And then we come up with sort of standardized procedures. How do we react to informal language? How do we react to false stops? And in interviews, for instance, and our general guideline is stick as close to the original as possible, standardize as correct as little as possible, because we really feel like that authentic voice is important and we don't want to interfere with that too much. And in terms of that's one of your other questions. That's generally the editors. So Kristen Lovis is the project director, because she really sort of deserves a heightened position here. She does a lot of the important work, and she's one of the founding members of this. But the major editorial staff, that's really Kristen Hilton and myself. But we generally coordinate with all of our current collaborators, our student collaborators, on most major decisions. We do have an editorial board. Most of our conversation with those editorial board members have been fairly informal, but if we have any sort of major structural or content changes to the site, we will also contact that editorial board. And you can see more information on that in the About page on Movable. It tells you all of the people currently working on Movable, all of the people who have in the past contributed, and the editorial board. Maybe Kristen can briefly speak to the IRB question.
We've done IRBs for projects related to Movable, and so like research tied to it, but because it is, and Amy might be able to actually better answer this, I'll just turn it over to Amy. She knows way more about IRB than I do.
Well, there was a discussion with the IRB board about, whether to treat this as human subjects research and some of the pros and cons for that. And so in the beginning, and it doesn't mean that that might not change at some point, but in the beginning, the group really felt like that might not be the best thing to make these more accessible to folks. In terms of having the information out there. But as Kristen's saying, they have done some IRBs when they want to use data from Movable, but there were worries about putting it through an IRB and who would have access to that and what that might do to some of the content. And so those were some of the pieces that were discussed early on with some of the groups that do IRB on our campus to kind of look at that information. And again, the pros and cons of that, would that limit information and sharing and getting information out? So hopefully that answers the question.
And we really don't see this as sort of a clinical research-centric project, right? We see this more as a creative writing publishing platform. And if somebody else wanted to run analysis on that, right? That's up to them, but that's not the primary purpose of this. So we're not recruiting people as participants, but as people who want to share their story and get published, right? So we're more of a sort of virtual journal in that sense.
There's a question in the chat, or a couple related questions, and then there's a hand. So I'll do these two questions and then turn.
I think the hand might have been earlier.
Oh, then let's go to the hand first.
So,
Kelly?
Let's see. Can you hear me? Okay. Hey guys, I'm going to try not to just ramble at you. I'm so geeked out about everything that I've heard. I'm out of East Tennessee State University, and so I combine women's health. I specialize in women's health, culture, storytelling, and stigma. So everything you're doing, I just want to applaud you. I'm like a lot of the other your other audience. Of course, I'm thinking of as a qualitative researcher. I was like, wait a second, your IRB said what? Because I'm thinking about like coding data and why are you able to get stories and in effect disseminate them, and they're not considered data. But what I think I heard you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that what you're proposing is that if other people want to do secondary analyses on the existing stories, that you're using this as a creative writing platform, as a way of getting storytelling to address stigma. I hope you hear just so much enthusiasm from me and just so much applause. And also, I want to say really quickly before everybody else, if we were in a conference room, I know people would be rolling their eyes at me right now, but let me say something very quickly. I really appreciate the point about stigma and mapping, because I've been on grant projects, whereas the dirty little secret is, in order to get grant funding, you have to make us look as pathetic as possible. So you show all these maps. And you're like, and so I love what you guys are talking about, of zooming in on a community and saying, but here are the stories too. So as I told you, I didn't really have a question other than I just wanted to shout out just to you. Thank you so much. Really inspiring. Thank you.
And you are exactly right. There were a lot of discussions with the IRB about that, and how that might limit the platform. And so that's really the creative direction that Kristen and her team like really took in terms of looking at that. And you are so right about the maps and the need. We have to show those needs to get our to get those funding dollars, but this is another need too. This is a need to show the other story, to share that information, really to help individuals share their story. So thank you.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
just to briefly follow up on Amy's point, I usually work on 19th century texts, and I'm sort of seeing this as this vibrant corpus of texts that people generate, but they usually remain in sort of psychotherapeutical contexts and then disappear. And I'm just thinking about the future, right? This is a historical moment to a degree, and we have all of these grassroots voices about it, and that's worth preserving, and that's also part of this.
And if I may add another comment to the map commentary. So one of the problems, besides the obvious one that you brought up, is also that even when you just do a general Google search, just let's say the name of a community within Appalachia, unfortunately, you're also getting a lot of results about these communities, but from that perspective of the opioid crisis. So it's this kind of link, right, that is happening, with all these cartographic products that are associated to a particular place. And so, the quick image, quick reaction you get from a particular place just by doing a Google search is of, oh, it's an opiate problem. And so, that's kind of, I guess if you want to call it a second tier problem that has happened also with this map. So really hoping then that, to try to counter that process.
There's a couple of related questions in the chat. Narissa asked about, along with gender, would we consider adding sexual orientation and identity to the demographics? And then Danica asked, has the project included any specific outreach to the LGBTQ community in Appalachia? Starting with the second one, we had a call back, I think it was like a year or so ago, that I think was targeted toward LGBTQ storytellers, and it was like a specific. We didn't get a lot of submissions off of that, but we would love to do another call, and then I'll go ahead and, in fact, we have a couple of students who are doing like our social media and make that as a suggestion, because we also we have people who are on our staff and part of our editorial board who belong to the LGBTQ community. So it's something we care a lot about, and we would love to get more stories that would talk about sexual identity, certainly. In terms of demographics, I'll turn that over to Stefan and Hilton.
Yeah, so I probably read my mind because I did want to add a comment there. So, in terms of ethnicity, probably if you haven't already figured out, I'm Hispanic, but also, I speak Spanish. And in the Hispanic community, substance use disorder, it's also further stigmatized. In many ways, it's taboo, right? A lot of family members do not, it's hard for them to talk about, and unfortunately, they handle this by just not talking about it, just shunning the family member. And so in many ways, it's very hard to reach those members of the community. And so that is something that I think in the future we'll be hoping to address, how to really broaden our scope and how we're reaching out to minority communities, and particularly, of course, because we're Appalachia based. In many ways, that's even a taller order, because, of course, the demographics here in the region, really do not help us in that sense in terms of reaching out. So it's something that we will have to work harder at. And I think this is something also, even just for gathering data as a whole in general, in terms of how the opioid crisis has impacted, minority groups in Appalachia. It's also even hard for them. And I think, I know Amy probably can talk about that too. But that is something we're trying to do, reach out to minority communities, but also given that Spanish is my first language, one of my goals is also to see how to translate some of the workshop material that we have, so that we can also perhaps get stories in Spanish and reach out the community that way.
And related to the Spanish, Hilton has already translated some of our writing prompts. So when we've done different workshops, especially virtual workshops, we will simultaneously show an English language prompt and a Spanish language prompt. So we're really trying to be as inclusive as possible, and look toward growing that.
But it does make sense to probably add that to the demographic info field at some point. And I feel like we briefly had a discussion, and then that sort of got left off when the pandemic hit. But I should also note that some of this work can already be done by using the tags that we have. So we do have a race filter, a race tag, and a LGBTQ plus tag, which allows you to find stories that at least spend sort of a significant section talking about the issue. If they do, I don't think we have any takers for that tag yet, right? But as a functionality on that part of the site, it's already there, so it makes sense to add it to the demographic info as well. Thank you.
Yeah, and we didn't feel that suggestion meant that at all. There are certain groups who are higher at risk. There are a lot of health disparities in Appalachia that we're focusing in on with a lot of the work that's happening too. Even the question that they have on there about education and its link as a health disparity. In terms of access to treatment, or some of those pieces, they're really important demographics and things to explore and look at. I just want to comment and say thank you to Kristen, Hilton, Stefan, and Becca. We have these really big, hard social issues, and one of the best ways that we've really been able to see work happening and ways to address it is through collaboration. Everybody has some expertise to share and lend. And when we really break down those silos and come together to work on projects like this or other projects, that's when you see real movement happening. Because again, there are some folks who might be the behavioral health or counseling, but having access to help individuals tell their story, or ways to map that, and just really breaking down those silos, and challenging others to break down those silos to come together. And I think that also speaks to one of the reasons why they didn't want to have the IRB is, they really wanted to make this open platform for folks to be able to access. Is there another question? Anybody? I don't see any other comments in there. Any other questions? Thank you all so much for your time this morning. We really appreciated it. And Becca's project with Movable still going on through the rest of the month. So if you want to help work on social media posts to really get the word out, for the She Rose in recovery, we would love for folks to help share that out. And you can go on Movable's Facebook page to get that information, or the Collegiate Recovery Program.
And if you want to collaborate with us, just send us an email, contact us on social media. We're always happy to work with you. Or if you just want to submit your own story, that's also very welcome.
Yes, can submit right through the site. So.
Real quick, did you guys say, is there a special email for the She Rose story, or is it the exact same email? Is it the one email that you guys sent?
Yeah, you can send it to
And
the
you have no
Movable.
problem if I post that all over social media. By the way, I just have to tell you one more time, I just posted on Facebook about how I'm fangirling all over you guys. It's so embarrassing, but I'm going to share that if you're okay with me
Yeah,
sharing.
absolutely.
Wonderful.
Yeah, please do. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And let us know how you want to collaborate, Kelly. You said you're in Tennessee.
Yes, I'm over at East Tennessee State University.
That would be awesome. I don't think we have any like Tennessee collaborators right now, so that would be fantastic.
I'm surprised that you guys aren't hooked up with Rob Pack, who over in public health, who does all of the opioid and yeah, I really have had to resist not to like fling myself at you, because I'm, like many of you, involved in 50 million projects, but I have not been this excited about a project in a long time. So congratulations.
Thank
Congratulations. You. You've tempted me. I'm like, no, not another one. But you guys are just such a special team. Thank you. But yes, I will keep that in mind. But we have some good people over in public health. We have a lot of, I'm in communication and performance, but we have, storytelling in our program, and we just have a lot of good people that what you guys were saying about silos is so important. And it's something that we've worked to break down, but just the point that you guys are doing such amazing work. And I didn't know diddly squat about it until today. So really excited that you're continuing to break down silos.
Yeah, what you're sharing, I think we hear that a lot in Appalachia too, even when we're out in rural communities working or talking to them about any project. The dissemination of information is really a barrier for folks, I feel like, in rural areas.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that sometimes, and I haven't gotten any of that from you guys, there's that competitiveness, right? And we get territorial over our own projects, and it becomes about legacy. And so You guys are just doing such a great job of presenting a welcoming, let's collaborate, because you're right. This isn't going to get done if we keep to our own little territory. So thank you all.
Yeah, and I think just one example of that is the Great Rivers collaboration we have. They are way better at getting people who want to do video interviews than we are. And so why would we try to reproduce that? We're like, yeah, the work you're doing is awesome. How can we help you preserve that somewhere and spread the word about what you've done? So yeah, the more that we can collaborate with other people who are doing similar projects or otherwise want to share stories, we're happy to do that.
Well, and I'm thinking about over at UT, Dr. Sadie Hudson. I don't know what they're doing in terms of digital storytelling. They were doing digital storytelling around HIV and end of life. But I'm thinking about what you guys are talking about is digital storytelling and this opportunity for what Hilton was talking about earlier of zooming in on communities, and you see the letters. But boy, this power. And by the way, our College of Medicine did cancer stories. And so you could go in and they did interviews with cancer survivors. So that opportunity to even have someone read the letter and digitally record it, video record it, might add some more texture, but you just have so many great opportunities there. So thank you. I've dominated the conversation, so I'm gonna.
Thank you. And Travis, I didn't put together that you were that Travis.
I am that Travis indeed.
That's so awesome. I think I emailed you like 400 years ago because somebody who's in the collection emailed us, and then I think I don't know if you or somebody references us briefly in the collection.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Is the book out now officially?
It is out and right beside me.
Sweet.
So I love this. This project is right up my alley. And actually, I was thinking about a colleague of mine who is in our ag college of all places. His name is Chris Haddix, and he does songwriting workshops with 4-H kids, and has touched on some of these things. So if you don't know Chris, Haddox is how you spell the last name. He's been doing a lot of work in Wyoming and Logan counties, especially. So for that music piece, I'll let him know that you're interested in music things, but you might want to reach out to him as well. So
yeah. We'll do.
Great work. Well, thank you so much for this. I'm going to end our session and hope that you enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
You too.